And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Vint Cerf, who will spend the next hour telling us what skin Google has in the game regarding freedom to connect. I have been accused in public forums of being a Google shill, and I have to say that it's only true when Google deserves it, which happens to be most of the time, but not all the time. So they adopted this don't be evil mantra for a reason, and that reason is that they realize that they could be evil and that they certainly have a lot of power, and as long as they're conscious of how they use that power, I'm pleased to have them as a sponsor. Vint Cerf is bigger than Google, no matter how big Google is. Anyway, Vint, I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks very much, David.
Okay. Take as much time as you want. Stop you earlier if you want to take questions if you wish.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. So, first of all, I apologize that I was not with you for the earlier parts of this meeting. Unfortunately, some high priority things popped up that I wasn't able to control, and so you have me sort of at the end here, wondering what happened for the last day and a half. So I may say things that are repetitive, and if you find them to be so, you should just say so, and I'll go on to the next topic. Second, I would invite discussion, although everybody here I hope knows I'm hearing impaired, so I didn't mean to come to be the guy that came to talk and didn't listen, but I might have to get some help to understand some of the questions or statements. Let me start out, first of all, by saying that we've been a strong supporter of David's work, Freedom to Connect, and other similar activities, partly because the freedom to connect has been reducing lately, not going up, despite the fact that there's been fairly dramatic growth in the internet all around the world. But at the same time that growth has occurred, there has also been a substantial amount of pressure coming from a variety of sources to try to limit what people are allowed to do using this very fundamental infrastructure. There is evidence of that in several different places. The most startling for me, most recent and startling, is this copyright alert system that I hope some of you, was that discussed during the week or during the, wasn't, okay, so.
Six strikes?
I'm sorry?
6 strikes?
6 strikes, yes, okay, that instead of 3, Hadopi in France. What this is something that I gather must have been cooked up by the intellectual property community. I use the word community very lightly here. I have other descriptors which I won't use in public. But their idea is to turn the internet service provider community, at least in the United States, into a police force to observe whether or not you are violating copyright. Now, you must imagine that the mechanisms by which they are likely achieving this, and I don't have any details that I can relate, so I am speculating here, but deep packet inspection comes to mind, examination of the destination IP addresses come to mind. Considering that they often run the resolvers, it's possible that the resolvers are keeping track of things. I don't know. But there's obviously a fair amount of analysis that would have to be done about your traffic in order to decide there's an issue. And if they conclude that that you are obtaining or generating material which is under copyright for which you do not have the right to either retrieve or to disperse, if they detect this, they will take action, and at some point it escalates. Maybe David can say, if after you get to the sixth strike, do they disconnect you from the network? We don't know. Okay. So let's take this as a homework assignment. Those of you who feel as strongly as I do anyway about the importance of being able to use the internet pretty much any way you want to. I'm not advertising illegality here, but I am saying that people should be free to do things that are within the realm of legality at their own choice. Let's do some homework and find out how this actually works and what kinds of enforcement and what kinds of penalties are proposed. Now, this is 2013. Many of you will remember 2012 and the January 18th blackout and the defeat of the pursuit of the PIPA and SOPA legislation. Some people don't agree with my analysis, but I suggest to you that part of the reason that the resistance worked is that it was an election year. And the supporters of those bills were in competition with others who sought their seats. And those opponents used the PIPA and SOPA legislation as a political tool to say, don't vote for that person, that incumbent, vote for me because that incumbent is trying to shut down your rights. As soon as it was clear that this was a politically toxic topic, everybody ran away. 2013 is not an election year. These bills or something like them will return. And some of the leverage that our community had in trying to shut down that legislation was a consequence of the election politics, which we will not have as a lever during 2013. 2014 is coming up. Of course, it will be an election year, at least for some portion of both the Senate and the House. But I want you to be conscious of the fact that we can't beat our chests and say, look how terrific and powerful we are, without understanding the nature of the leverage that we exercise. I think Elliot's point about voting with your feet and with your wallet is a very good one, and that's a powerful meme that we shouldn't forget. But some of these things have little to do with money, and they have a great deal to do with politics. There is also, in my view, a serious lack of competition. There is, at least in the broadband sector, it continues to concentrate, and certainly at least in the United States. We're seeing some pretty interesting experiments, especially the one in Australia, where the government has decided to pay for the cost of putting fiber in all over the country. I think this is going to be a very important exercise to follow to see whether or not the side effect of that is in fact going to be an ignition of GDP growth because people have access to and can compete with each other for the use of that underlying facility. When I look at the situation with the American U.S. Postal Service, which is losing money and shutting down possibly delivery, and well, in fact, it is delivery on Saturday. I guess it's supposed to be shut down in August of this year. Other facilities are likely to be shut down. I get worried when I see that happening because that's sort of a fundamental infrastructure, the ability to deliver something at a reasonable cost to some destination. Now, of course, we have competitors like DHL and FedEx and UPS and the like, but they're pretty expensive services. And the best bargain in the world, maybe it was too much of a bargain, given the economics, has always been the ability to post a letter. That whole business is starting to crater because so much of the first-class mail stream is going online. But that doesn't mean that everything can be sent online. We haven't quite got the matter transmitters and the transporters working, and the ones I've seen anyway have little checksum errors, and you come in inside out, and it's not a good thing. So until that actually gets fixed, we really need an infrastructure that can do physical delivery. So I am very worried that the path that we're on right now is in fact eroding what should be a national infrastructure. And I think we could worry a little bit about the commercial side of things, commercial services for access to internet. There's a fair amount of competition in the wireless space, but once again, my concern there is that it isn't very open. not so much in the sense of admitting new competitors, but more in the sense of what you can do with the devices that you get, that you pay dearly for. And once again, the lock on the device and the limits as to what applications can be run is still concerning to me. I like the notion of an application that finds crappy apps and gets rid of them, as we could call that CRAP, C-R-A-P-P, and that could now become a new service that somebody could offer. Now, our problem in terms of legislation is not confined to the domestic scene. Those of you who watched the run-up to IGF and the World Telecommunications the World Conference on International Telecommunications, will see that there is an international component to all this. What's coming up next is the World Conference on Telecom Policy. Before that, there was a World Telecommunications Standards Alliance meeting. There will be the plenipotentiary meeting of the ITU. All of these are ITU bodies. And I think it was very instructive to observe this WICET meeting where there was, for the first time, a really severe schism. 89 countries voted to, or shouldn't they voted, but decided to sign the treaty, and 55 countries didn't. And I'm very pleased that the United States did not sign it, partly on the grounds that the language in the international telecom regulations as modified introduced language that brought applications and content into the debate. Never in the past history of the ITRs has content ever been an issue. It's almost as if had this discussion been in the context of telephony, those words would have suggested we can interfere with your ability to say what you want to say on the telephone, and I think all of us would react pretty negatively to that. There's no reason why we should be restricted as to what we can say on the internet either to first order. And yet that's what was proposed. And so this expansion of authority was resisted by quite a few countries. Nonetheless, the damage has been done. And by this I mean that any country that has signed that treaty and chooses to exercise severe restraints on what people can say and what they can do with the internets in their countries will turn to that treaty and say, don't look at me, I'm following the international regulations. So don't blame me if you think this is a human rights violation. I'm following what was agreed in Dubai in December. This is not a good outcome. So I think that that is still going to be with us as time goes on. We have the other meetings coming up, the telecom policy meeting, the plenipotentiary, where the ITU is free to rewrite its work plan to add new things. And if you've been following, you know that they kept creeping into the internet space since the other space is evaporating, right? Telephony has moved over into the internet, video has moved over into the internet, pretty much everything has moved over into that technology. Well, on the international front, in addition to things like WICET and so on, there's the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, some of you, how many remember ACTA? Quite a few people. You remember that was the Anti-Counterfeiting and Trademark Act, which was defeated in large measure because a lot of very brave European countries said no. TPP has similar kinds of potential in it, and I think, once again, it behooves us to look very carefully at what language is in there. And it's getting somewhat difficult to find out because a lot of those negotiations don't take place in a transparent way. I'd like to shift gears for just a second because there is, as you know, a continuing debate about cybersecurity. Now, this is not a silly debate. There are real serious harms that can take place in the internet, whether it's essentially commandeering your computer to become part of a botnet, which then is used to either do denial of service attacks or generate spam or do other kinds of things, or possibly obtaining access to your machine and then doing keylogging and other things of that sort. Those are real problems. They are serious problems, and we shouldn't ignore them. The question is what to do about them. And so often the term security, especially cybersecurity, tends to swiftly lump itself into the same discussion with national security. Now, I'm not comfortable with this easy slide from cybersecurity to national security. And in consequence of this discomfort, and I'm going to come back to why that makes me uncomfortable, I want to introduce another meme, and I may have mentioned this the last time I was here. Safety is a really interesting term because we all want to feel and be safe in the internet. We want to feel that when we go out and use applications, when we go to websites, that it's reasonable that we would be safe and not infected by our use of the system. We all know that you can go to a website, and everybody who knows even a little bit about the World Wide Web knows how browsers work. They go out to the network and they download the home page and then they interpret it. Now, years ago, when Tim Berners-Lee did his early web design, most of the stuff that was in HTML format was images, formatting stuff, and text, and that was it. That's pretty innocuous. I mean, you download that and you try to interpret it to make a nice magazine-like presentation on the page. The trouble is, in 2013, when you download that homepage, it's got Java or JavaScript or Python or other high-level languages, which are interpreted by the browser. Now, depending on the browser's design, depending on the level of privilege it is given by the operating system, the execution of those high-level languages might actually store malware on your machine, alter the operating system, or do other kinds of significant damage, often surreptitiously. So now the question is what to do about that. And in one instance, there's an organization which I chair called Stop Badware. It's a not-for-profit which will respond to complaints about websites that have become infected. Some of you will know that when Google does the indexing of the internet, our software also tries to identify whether there is malware on the site. Now, anyone with a little bit of computer science background knows that a program trying to figure out what another program is doing is actually an impossible task. There's some Turing halting problems hiding in there. But nonetheless, we do our best to recognize that there might be malware on the site. And if there is, we make a note of that. And if you use the Google search engine and one of the destinations happens to be one of those potentially infected sites, we pop up this big red page saying, we don't think you should go there. There may be malware that will harm your computer or cause other damage. Now, you can still go there. We don't stop you, but we try to warn you. Now, of course, the people who run those websites are almost invariably absolutely insulted by the possibility that we've accused them of housing malware or badware on their sites. And so they call and complain. We send them to Stop Badware, which does an in-depth analysis of that target site. And generally speaking, I don't know that the statistics are 100%. I'm sure they aren't. But they're very, very high fraction of the cases there really is malware there. It's not that the website operator put it there. In fact, most of them didn't. It's because their own security is so crappy that somebody else got in and put the malware on that site. So Stop Badware helps them clean that out. Now, there's a certain recidivism rate here, and in fact, that would be a statistic that's worth looking at. But the idea here is that we, among others, would like to make the network a safer place to be. And I'd like to have that meme, this notion of cyber safety, part of our vocabulary to offset the tendency to slide into national security rhetoric. Let me give you a metaphor, which, like all metaphors, is a little weak. But let's suppose that your house is burning down and you're standing there with a garden hose and you realize, I need somebody with a bigger hose and more water. And so what do? Well, you don't call the police department, you call the fire department because they have big hoses and more water, and their job is to put the fire out. There are an awful lot of people and businesses in the United States and elsewhere that are not prepared to protect themselves from various kinds of attack, just like you and I are not really prepared to put out a serious house fire with a garden hose. So we need a fire department to call, a cyber fire department. We don't have one today, and the analogy is, I'll give you some examples of why this analogy isn't perfect, but I think that we should be thinking about institutions that actually help the rest of us recover from some of these potential hazards. Big companies like Google and others have the ability to defend themselves. We have the skill sets, we have the capacity in order to fight back. But small businesses and individuals like you and me don't necessarily have that capability. So we need someplace to call. Interestingly enough, the fire department analogy has a couple of interesting features to it. One of them is they come and put the fire out. The second thing is that after the fire is out, they try to figure out how it started. If it turns out that there's evidence that this is arson, then they turn it over to the police department or maybe even the FBI, depending on circumstances. So, and the third thing the fire department does, they'll come out and inspect the house or the building or whatever, your office, to see whether or not it meets code or whether there are things that you could do to make it safer. Well, I can imagine a cyber fire department having roles like that. Now, there's an open question: who would pay for that? And I don't know the answer to this yet. But we treat this as a civic responsibility, and there are taxes that go to some fire departments. Others are volunteer. I guess I'm a little edgy about having volunteer cyber fire departments because we don't know whether the people who have volunteered are actually putting out fires or starting them. I sometimes feel that way about the antivirus companies, and I hope I haven't insulted anybody, but it's just a little nightmare in my own head. But I want you to also consider that this notion of critical infrastructure, which is a common term that's used a lot, it's even showing up in legislative language, that this term, critical infrastructure, tends to be interpreted as the power generation systems, the transportation systems, and the other major infrastructures that we do rely on. I don't disagree with their being critical. The thing that I find sort of unsatisfying about that focus of attention is that you and I, with our laptops and desktops and mobiles, are part of this nation's economy. And what we do and what we are vulnerable to has an effect. In fact, some of the cyber attacks, especially the spear phishing attacks, start by going after an individual, figuring out how to break into their email or their social networking sites and other things, and then use that as leverage to get deeper and deeper into the system until finally they get to the target that they're after. Sometimes it could be very indirect. You can imagine someone trying to figure out, okay, how do I break into company X? Well, let me get on LinkedIn and find out who is associated with company X. What can I do to ingratiate myself? How do I get, and can I get 2 or 3 hops into the system? Would you please introduce me to so-and-so? You can imagine a sequence of events where the initial interactions look pretty innocuous, but the target is elsewhere. So these possibilities and these kinds of scenarios are not unreal. So I think we're part of the critical infrastructure too, although I'm shy away from saying that overly loudly, because if being labeled cyber infrastructure or something means a whole bunch of obligations, costs, and other kinds of constraints and restrictions, that might not be what we're looking for. But if we don't think of ourselves as part of the important cohort in this cyber ecosystem, then we're actually forgetting that a lot of the penetrations take place going through us and not through some of the other more obvious front doors. I think one of the important things that we can all undertake, and Google, I think we've tried very hard to do this, is to expose what's going on in the world in terms of attempts to suppress, in terms of attempts to pull information from companies about users and individuals and what they are doing. I'm sure that over the course of the last day and a half or two that China has come up. They're not the only parties that are interested in what's going on in the net. There are others, including some that are domestic, that I think are equally interested. The idea here is that we'd like to make that more visible, because the more transparent it is, the more light you shine, the harder it's going to be to do some of these things surreptitiously. And that's why we have a transparency report at Google, where we try to say, here are the countries that have asked for information, asked to suppress information and the like, and this is how we've responded to them. We could use a lot more of that. Although I think from some of the brief remarks I heard earlier as I got in, and I'm guessing at others that may have been made in the last day or two, visibly exposing some of this stuff puts you in jeopardy in some countries in the world. So I mean, we need to be conscious of that. Which brings me to another point, and that has to do with anonymity. I am still a believer that anonymity is, in fact, an important feature. A lot of people don't agree with that. Their argument is you can say a lot of really bad things, some of which may not be true, as an anonymous party and cause a lot of harm. And I don't actually disagree with that point. On the other hand, it's also true that in some parts of the world, if you are not anonymous and you say something that should be said, you may be in jeopardy, and we heard some of that earlier in the videos that were shown. So I have these funny, almost schizophrenic view about anonymity. I recognize that it's potentially a hazard, but I also recognize its importance. And this leads me to an interesting speculation about what I'll call strong authentication. All of you are probably familiar with the evolution of public key cryptography since 1977. It's gotten pretty sophisticated. One of the interesting features of public key crypto is that you need two keys. One you can treat as public and one you treat as private. And as long as you never release the private key, you have this very interesting asymmetric capability. If you publish your private or your public key, then someone can communicate with you securely by encrypting things in your public key, and only you can decrypt them. If, on the other hand, you want somebody to know it was you that sent something, you can encrypt something in your private key and send it out, and if it can be decrypted with your public key, which you've made public, other people know it must have come from you. So that's digital signing. And so this interesting symmetry of confidentiality and digital signing is a very powerful tool. So let me give you kind of a little scenario to show you how it might be possible to build up quite a powerful security and authentication system starting from almost nothing, except for the premise that public key cryptography works. And here I'm pretending that key sizes are big enough to protect us for quite a long time, not counting the possibility of quantum computing, in which case it's time for us to go off and look for a different crypto method than using factoring of prime numbers. And if anybody with any brain who's working in this space knows that that's a threat, and they're going to have to go find some new crypto ideas. But let's imagine that David and I are interacting with each other. We don't know each other. And I get a message from David saying, "Hi, I'm David, and here's my public key." So my first thought is, well, let's see if he has a private key to go with it. So I generate a random number, and I encrypt it in his public key, which he's just given to me, which he should be able to decrypt with his private key. And I say, "Hi, I'm Vint, and here's my public key." So David decrypts the random number and then sends it back to me encrypted in my public key, which I then decrypt. And I verify that David must have a private key that works because he decrypted the number, re-encrypted it in my public key. And I send that number back to David, so he now knows that I have a public and private key pair as well that work. Okay, now at this point, all we know is that there's a guy named David and a guy named Vint, and they each have public keys. End of story. Well, and then private keys to go with. That's all we know. We have no idea who we are. On the other hand, if later David sends another message saying, "Hi, it's David again, and here's my public key," or maybe he just says, "Hi, it's David again," and I say, well, let's see if it's the same David. So I generate a random number encrypted in his public key, and we go back and forth again. Now, David and Vint know that they're still talking to the same David and Vint, unless, of course, the private key has been compromised. So, or something's been broken. I mean, but let's assume for a moment that everything else is okay. At this point, we now have established a way of communicating with each other, which need not necessarily be confidential, but could be. But in any case, it has the high probability that it's the same parties interacting with each other. Now, later, David says, "Hi, it's David again, and I want to borrow $50,000. All of a sudden, I think I want to know more about David than his first name and his public key. So I send a message to David saying, "Dear David, do you have a job? Do you have any assets? What's your credit rating? And where do you live? How do I find you again in case things go wrong?" And David sends this long thing back to me, and I look at it, and it looks pretty good, except what if he's lying? So now I have the problem of, I'm sorry, there's that. I could say, "David, you need to tell me all this stuff." He could say, "No, I won't tell you that," and I'll say, "Fine, the conversation's over." Or he sends the material to me, and I say, "I wonder if he's lying," and I go find a third party that I trust. who can validate David's statements. And if, in fact, I trust the party, they validate David's statements, then maybe I will seriously consider loaning him $50,000. Of course, what they may send back is that he's a deadbeat, and I'll say, sorry, David, I can't do that. But the idea here is that we built up this capability to communicate in a fairly reliable way without knowing much about each other. And only at the point where both of us decide we need to know more, we agree to exchange that information. We're not forced to do that. There are some places in the world that want to force you to identify yourself absolutely by identity before you can even get on the net. You hear about things like internet driver's licenses and things of that sort. This leads me to one other observation, which is that identity and identifiers are not the same thing, and many people conflate them. I think it's perfectly okay to have a pseudonym, maybe more than one pseudonym, and to use that in any way you wish. But what's important is that you don't have to turn that into identity unless and until you want to. And if a party insists on that, you can decide, do I want to give that information, or do I not want to avail myself of whatever the product or service happens to be? So I think that we have some work to do in trying to make sure that we use public key crypto, identity and identifiers, and pseudonymity in ways that are both creative and give maximum flexibility to the users of the system. I just have a couple more points to make. One of them has to do with open source. This is not a panacea, but it's certainly a very nice way of at least showing people what is it that they're getting. Now, some people will say, well, you can look at the open source, but what if they also give you a binary compiled copy? How do we know the two are the same? There's a whole bunch of questions like that. But on the presumption that people are being fairly straight about all this, having the ability to take open source, modify it if you like, compile it, and place it on a platform is a pretty powerful tool for several reasons. One of them is that it allows for evolution. Now, it doesn't have to be totally open-ended evolution either. In the case of Google's Android and the Chrome browser, we manage open source software, and we release instances of it with very silly names like ice cream sandwich and so on. The important thing here is that you don't necessarily have to use our releases. You're free to take the source code and change it if you want to. On the other hand, if there's a kind of a track on which this thing is evolving, if you start making changes to the source code, you have to go back and reintegrate any of the changes in. That could be somewhat tricky. The thing that's important is you get to see what the software is that you're using. And I think that's powerful. In fact, to give you another analogy that you'll recall, in the very earliest days of browsers, one of the things that was interesting about them is that if you asked, you could see the source code, the HTML of the web page that you were looking at. Now, this had a very interesting consequence. People would see web pages that they thought were really cool, and they could go look at the source and then replicate that or copy and change and modify. The webmaster didn't exist until people started learning from each other. And this powerful mutual reinforcement has led to a lot of the World Wide Web's fluid evolution over time. So this idea of keeping things open